everyone. It's Pospo and BRAINCAST for Mostly Learning. It's the first Monday of July and summer is officially here. Yes, I know you wish you were watching this while lying on a sandy beach under the burning sun, though I doubt you would be watching this if you were on the beach. But anyway, last week, despite heaps of technical difficulties, humans did prevail over technology, and we did manage to have an admittedly more relaxed conversation with the outgoing president of the Royal College of Psychiatrists, Professor Wendy Byrne. Don't worry too much if you missed it. Just go to monsterlearning.com and all videos are there for you to watch whenever you want, even under the burning sun. This week, we open our virtual doors and welcome Dr. Lade Smith. Having trained at Guy's Hospital Medical School, she completed her psychiatry training here at the Maudsley, and just a few years later, here she is, the clinical director for the forensic services at SLUM, and several groundbreaking papers under her belt. With a wide research interest from mental health law to side effects of psychotropic medications, Dr. Smith has been a powerful voice for Black mental health and the advancement of mental health equality. Lade, welcome to BRAINCAST.
Thank you for having me. Thank you for inviting me.
Lade, I'm not going to waste any time and cut straight to the chase. So 2017, the ESOP 10 study clearly shows that compared with white British, Black Caribbean and Black African patients experienced worse outcomes, adding that baseline social disadvantage contributed to this disparity. Lancet Psychiatry 2019, in your team's meta-analysis of ethnic variations in compulsory detention under the Mental Health Act, you write that the migrant groups, and that includes Black Caribbean, Black African, and South Asian patients, they were significantly more likely to be compulsorily admitted to hospital compared with white patients. Why that is?
Okay, so just to be really clear, it wasn't just migrant groups. What we did in that study was to try and update the existing systematic reviews and meta-analyses about rates of detention for specific ethnic minority populations. So as you say, Black, Asian, and other minority ethnic groups. And we also added migrants, so migrants as a whole, and it included migrants who are white migrants as well as migrants who are Black or South Asian. And what we did, we found, no great surprise, that there were higher rates for all populations who were ethnic minority, and higher rates of detention if you're a migrant population as well. But what we did that was different was to look at the reasons why, the explanations that were given for why there were these higher rates of detention. And this is where it gets really interesting. So it makes it different to other studies. Because what we found was that actually there were some reasons that were given that were supported by evidence. That included poor adherence to treatment, residential instability, interesting racial bias in inpatient treatment, where the service was situated, ethnic density in the population, and also the perception of services and mental illness by the people who were using them. The problem is this, that 47% of the explanations given, that's almost half of those explanations that were given by the researchers in their conclusions, were actually not supported by any evidence at all, or they just didn't give an explanation. Now, that would be fine if it weren't for the fact that, I mean, we looked at these papers over many years. If it wasn't for the fact that then subsequent researchers used the erroneous conclusions of the previous researchers, i.e. conclusions based on no supported evidence, as the basis for their research, saying, you know, we know that there's a higher rate of detention, and explanations that were given that had no supported evidence included things like having a high rate of comorbid drug use in Black people, or greater stigma, you know, greater stigma in the community, in the population, and or illness being expressed as violence, for example. And the problem with that, of course, is then the subsequent research used that as the reason why you get higher rates. And so that erroneous conclusion was propagated again and again and again. And the problem with that is this, that if you have to question, number one, you have to question the scientific merit of employing, you know, study conclusions that actually aren't based on any evidence. a lot of the papers, unfortunately, mushed everybody together. So there were kind of inappropriate equivalencies between the different ethnic minority groups, and they were often used quite simplistic methodologies. But the main problem was that if you retain these untested explanations, many of which unfortunately entrenched kind of, old narratives of racial determinism, it means that when you try to develop an intervention, your intervention doesn't work. So nothing changes. And lo and behold, over the past 35, 40 years, that same statistic of finding that there are increased rates of detention has just not changed. What we think, probably, what I think anyway, is it probably hasn't changed because we haven't really found out the proper answers. So in answer to your actual question, why, we don't really know, because the research just hasn't been done quite well enough. I mean, I'll take my hat off to Craig Morgan and everyone in the ESOP team, because they've probably done some of the best work in this area, and they have been trying. But other than that, almost half of the explanations just not good enough.
I mean, you already hinted, on my next question. So, are you happy with the use of the term BAME? And for people not familiar with this acronym, it stands for Black, Asian, and Minority Ethnic. So basically, all ethnic groups except white, which, to be honest, doesn't sound right to me. It feels the same when people say to me, and I'm Greek, oh, you Mediterraneans. Well, yes, I am Mediterranean, but there are 22 countries that are Mediterranean. And I can assure you, we're very different to each other. So to come back to my question, are you happy with the use of the term BAME?
So, yeah, BAME is an abbreviation, and actually you described it very, very well. Often you'll hear people use the term BAME. I don't use that term. I don't use it because it literally is mushing everybody together. BME, as long as people understand this is Black, Asian, and minority ethnic, there are commonalities, but there are some significant differences. And it's really important to know that, because although there may be similar, I might have similar experiences. I'm from my origin is Black African origin. I might have similar experiences to someone in Britain who's Black Caribbean, but actually the roots of migration from our parents, I'm second generation, if they're second generation, the roots of migration are really very different. For example, South Asian groups, you've got in the 1980s, 1 in 20 Indian men in Britain was a doctor. Compare that to in the 1980s, people who were from Bangladesh, a significant proportion were coming as refugees from somewhere that was very poor, but somewhere that was very flooded, actually. And so they were escaping real hardship. And actually, lo and behold, when you look at the outcomes for people who are of Indian origin in Britain and people who are of Bangladeshi origin, they have really different levels of social outcome. With Indian people doing generally pretty well, and Bangladeshi people really bumbling along the bottom, not doing very well at all. And if you mush everybody together, you miss that, and you miss the nuances. In fact, actually, frankly, it's not even nuances. There's quite significant differences between these groups. That's the problem with, certainly using the term BAME and using the term, basically, you're not white. And that doesn't tell you anything. All that tells you is that, again, it's like funny if it's an example of some of the structural issues that we have around race.
And I mean, in a recent correspondence to the Lancet Psychiatry in this month, in 2020, you propose that at the outset of any research, there should be a race equality impact assessment. So what do you mean by that?
So I suppose it links to what I was saying before about, what we found in our paper, actually. And oftentimes what we find, and researchers I know that researchers at the Institute are really well-meaning and really careful, etc., etc. But all too often, the research that's been done only works for white people because it's only done on white people. And what we're saying is, from the outset of any research, you should be asking yourself, okay, let's say you want to research side effects of antipsychotic medication. What you should be asking yourself is, okay, we want to research side effects of antipsychotic medication. Who are the people it's going to affect? Well, it's going to affect, it could be anybody. It's not just, white people. Actually, let's say antidepressants is probably a better example. It could affect anybody. So we need to make sure that when we're doing our methodology, that it's that we're going to be able to recruit enough people who are representative of the population. Now, what often happens is people will say, oh, well, we recruited people, but we didn't have many people from ethnic minority groups, so we excluded them because we only had a few. Actually, I'd say, no. What you should be doing is thinking, what do we need to do to recruit people of ethnic minority groups? It might mean saying to the funding body, actually, we need an extra 3 months because it's going to take a little bit more work, a little bit more effort. So we want some extra money for these 3 months. And this is something that Stephanie Hatch talks about really nicely, actually, that what we should be doing is thinking, what can we do to make sure that our research is the outcomes are going to be outcomes that are going to work for everybody? Because if you only research one group of people, then your research is only going to be relevant to that group of people.
Yeah.
And what you should be doing is trying to research, think about your question right from the beginning, think about your methodology, and think about what it will mean for all these other groups of people and involve them right at the start and right the way throughout. That's what we mean by doing a race equality impact assessment.
Let's talk a bit about the pandemic. So in the Lancet, there was an article that looked into the death due to COVID-19 in New York. And what they found is that there were disproportionately high rates of death among African Americans. In another article in the JAMA, they found that Bronx, the neighborhood of the New York City with the highest proportion of racial and ethnic minorities, the most persons living in poverty, and the lowest levels of educational attainment, they had the higher rates of hospitalization and deaths. So what happened here in the UK?
Okay, so it's very sad, actually, but what happened, I was actually involved in the Public Health England review that was led by Professor Kevin Fenton. And what that review found, because people were starting to notice that, the percentage of, I think it's something like 34% of people in ITU were from Black, Asian, minority ethnic backgrounds, which was really concerning, considering that, as far as we're aware, only about 15 or maybe 16% of the population is from a, BAME background. So it was like, uh-oh, what's going on here? When they had a look at it, what they found is that what's amazing, I have to say, one of the things that was amazing to me is that people were saying maybe it's genetic. Just to remind everybody out there, someone who is Black, African, has different genetic makeup to someone who is Filipino, say. And there were lots of Filipinos who had issues as well. So it wasn't genetic. And what the Public Health England review found, that actually social factors are really important. So there are issues around housing, issues around public transport. It's interesting that there was a, there was a finding that if you were from an ethnic minority background, you're much more likely to work in an occupation that put you at higher exposure to COVID. So you're much more likely to be on the front line if you're an NHS worker. You're more likely to be working as a cleaner, bus driver, that kind of thing. And so you had much more exposure than if you were, say, a white person who had a kind of, more middle class job, working at home at your computer.
Yeah.
And what they also found in that review was that that people's history and experience of racism and their poorer experiences of healthcare meant that when they did have symptoms, they were less likely to seek care when they needed it, which is really concerning. And for NHS staff who were from ethnic minority groups were less likely to speak up to say that they had concerns about risk or they had concerns about the amount of PPE they had. So you've got this weird situation where, and also the other thing is that, of course, a lot of people from ethnic minority backgrounds who were getting COVID, what they found is that they were using public transport more, having to go to work and having to go to work using public transport. And that's probably an indication of income as well.
So I'm not saying all of them, but are some of these deaths then a reflection of systemic racism? And for people that are not really familiar, can you please tell us in a nutshell, what is systemic racism?
So people often make the mistake of confusing. There are different types of racism. So the first thing to say is that race is a socio-political construct. Okay, so for those of you who don't know that, we haven't got much time to go into that all now, but I would say go and have a look at Hannah Arendt's work from the 40s. And she was a Jewish philosopher who wrote a lot about, in fact, 30s and 40s. She wrote a lot about essentially racial discrimination in the time of eugenics, etc. It's very interesting stuff. And she describes it beautifully. And the thing is that obviously everyone knows what overt racism is. If someone, individual racism, I walk down the road, someone calls me a nasty name. That's that's individual racism, fine. The problem is that for hundreds of years, there have been historical, cultural, institutional, and interpersonal practices that are embedded and normalized into the way in which, into our society and the way in which society functions. So normalized that none of us recognize them. It's not to say that if you're ethnic minority, you recognize it all the time at all, actually. But it means that those structures actually result in, and they're consistent, they consistently advantage one group and consistently disadvantage other groups. So a kind of fairly trite example, but an important example is this. So if you were to look up flesh coloured, right, on a paint palette, if you could look it up now, those of you at home, you know, look it up on your internet now. Flesh coloured, it comes out as a kind of pink, maybe pink brown kind of colour. It's an actual recognised colour, flesh colour. Or you go to, if I go to supermarket, go to supermarket aisle, you know, Tesco, Sainsbury's, whatever one of your choice, Waitrose in my case, you go to supermarket aisle and you look for tights, and the tights will say nude, nearly black, black. Nude is a particular colour. Nude is a colour which is a kind of light beige colour. That's not the colour of my skin when I'm nude, actually, just to let everyone know. And so nude is a particular colour, but it's a colour based on, if you like, a kind of white Eurocentric approach. And that's been the case for hundreds of years. And, you know, understandably, because it's actually, you know, the people, it's if you like, you know, people who write the history, the people who win the wars. And so a lot of the, and the problem is that a lot of the history, the culture we have is very Western, and the problem is it excludes other people. So if I go to buy some tights, I'm excluded from buying tights. And that's where the problem comes, and that's a trite example, but the problem comes because those structures that are in place that we don't question serve to exclude people generally from being able to share in wealth, for example, being able to have better housing, better education. And that's not for everybody. There'll be people now saying, but look at you, you're doing all right. I know people who are doing, yes, there are people doing really well, but generally there is a disadvantage for many ethnic minority groups in actually just in the world full stop, but certainly in Western societies. And that's a very long-standing structural problem that is difficult to shift because all of us are so used to it and essentially living in a society where there's inbuilt structural disadvantage.
Yeah, I mean, in a 2019 paper, Prof. Nebel talks of racial trauma, referring to the events of danger related to real or perceived experience of racial discrimination. And that includes threats of harm, threats of injury, humiliating, shaming events, or even witnessing harm to others due to real or perceived racism. So can you tell me a bit more about racial trauma?
So it's probably easier to understand it. In fact, this is a concept that people have talked about for years. But again, if people are interested, they should look at some work by Robert Carter in the kind of around the 60s, 70s. And, you know, and there's quite a few psychologists, psychiatrists, other social theorists who said, look, the problem is that you need to understand that if racism, and that's not just individual overt racism, but also the structural racism that happens in the institutional racism, makes people feel bad. It's traumatic. It's like it's not like an emotional trauma. It is an emotional trauma. And what we know about emotional trauma is that it increases the risk of developing psychopathology as an adult. So what you have to think about is this. This isn't something that just happens when you're an adult. If you are from an ethnic minority and you grow up in our society, what it means is that every single day of your life, you will be faced with negative views of yourself or an absence of yourself completely. You may not see yourself at all in films, in television, etc. So you are disregarded. You're either disregarded or at worst you are castigated, and you are shown to be thief, criminal, rapist, whatever it is, stupid, lazy. All the racially determined stereotypes are generally quite negative. And then, of course, there's the overt racism as well. The problem with that is that that's trauma, that feels for some people, it's such a trauma where everyone feels it, it's painful. But for some people, it's such a trauma that it actually can result in them developing. And you know, Helen Neville and Robert Cost, they talk about people developing what essentially are PTSD-like symptoms. Now, I would go further. Actually, I'd say what we know is that people who are subject to consistent, regular, repeated emotional trauma are much more likely to develop, throughout their lives, are much more likely to develop a picture that looks a bit more like what we now call something like complex PTSD. And actually, so I was, a colleague of ours, Emma Facer Irwin's, doing some lovely work on PTSD in prisons. And I said to her a few years ago, so Emma, what about black people in prisons? What's happening with those? She said, "Ooh, not any significant difference." So I don't think you're asking the right questions. It goes back to the point we were saying about asking the questions of what it might mean. Now, there's no reason why, if you're, somewhat a researcher who hasn't experienced this, that you would necessarily begin to think that I wonder what how might it feel for someone to be subjected to criticism every single day of their life about something they cannot change, their skin color. And I mean, that's the point. That's what it is. It's essentially, it's the development of mental health problems. And it's not just mental health problems, actually. There are physical health problems as well, related to the stress that comes about. And David Williams in Harvard has looked at this really nicely. He's mainly looked at physical health problems, but it's pretty clear that actually there's no reason why it wouldn't create mental health problems too. And that's what people are talking about when they talk about racial trauma. Essentially, it's the emotional trauma caused by racism. And some people are more resilient than others. So that's why not everyone gets ill.
You know what I find really interesting. So most of my Greek friends that live here in London, they wait until they go to Greece to see a doctor. Does this mean that Greek doctors are better? Yes, we are. Okay, no, we're not. But people feel more comfortable opening up and trusting someone of the same culture. This to me sounds even more pertinent when talking about racial trauma. So does Black mental health need more Black psychiatrists, or is this compartmentalizing healthcare in a way?
Well, I think probably, I mean, it would be compartmentalizing healthcare probably, but actually, I think the evidence is that probably it would be useful. Interestingly, there was a Black mental health, there's a service specifically for Black people, run by Black people in St Anne's Hospital in Tottenham. It was started by Kwame Mackenzie, who's now a professor of psychiatry in Toronto, trainee. And some people found it useful, but the outcomes were not that significantly different to the usual outcomes. It was still very, very hard. I think for me, if you're a Black person, then you understand about racism and racial trauma more easily. So it probably means that when a person comes in and they are talking to you, they get there quicker. It's probably a bit like a woman trying to explain period pain to a man. Actually, it takes a while and the man isn't going to fully get it, as understanding as he might be. Whereas with a woman's going to get it a lot quicker. However, I think that probably it would certainly help things, but you still have to be a good psychiatrist. It wouldn't be enough just to be Black.
Of course, of course. I mean, a great example, for people that what causes racial trauma. So George Floyd gets murdered by a white American policeman. And then suddenly, every CEO, manager, politician, you name it, they all start sending out emails against racism. On one hand, it's a good thing, right? But I can't help not being just a bit skeptical about all this, sudden awakening about racism. So how much of that is a tick box exercise, political benefit, or whatever else we want to call it, and how much is real, genuine interest? In the end of the day, does it really matter? Is it better than nothing?
Probably better than nothing. I don't know how much is real, genuine interest. There are going to be some organisations that really, really care about this and are really doing something. I mean, for example, Ben and Jerry's. I was amazed when I saw Ben and Jerry's. Because lots of people in certain bits of America like Ben and Jerry's, and they may not buy it anymore, so it's a potential commercial risk. But I suppose it might be a commercial big tick because there are a whole heap of other people who might buy a Ben and Jerry's now. What we know is that there are some organisations that have been thinking about this for a while, and it may feel like they've jumped on the bandwagon, but they haven't. So, for example, the Royal College of Psychiatrists, 2 years ago, they put out a statement, more than 2 years ago, actually, put out a statement about institutional racism in general, in society, and in mental health care. And actually, so they were already doing something. Plus, they developed an equalities resource to try and help this. They supported work around the patient and carer race equality framework, or a kind of person-centered race equality framework designed to try and reduce the impact of structural discrimination and structural racism. So there are certain organisations that have been doing things. And it's not always obvious, because what's happened recently is that the weight of evidence that indicates that there really is this systemic racism really is there, because lots of people have been denying it because they haven't noticed it for all the reasons we've explained. It's such a normalised part of our society. George Floyd and we were all made to witness this horrific killing. It was awful, awful. And so you couldn't deny it anymore. And it might be that some people, there are some people who jumped on the bandwagon, but I hope that there are enough people who have woken up and said, oh, this is too bad, actually, we want to try and make a difference, that the momentum is there, actually. So in a sense, does it matter? No, not really. As long as people work to support those who are trying to make a difference, to make that difference, and that they don't put obstacles in the way.
And many people just took the streets. Some other people started bringing down statues of slave traders, which, to be honest, up to a point, I have to say that it felt satisfying. However, just bringing down a statue, is that up to a point, at least, like sweeping history under the carpet?
I think there's a real risk of that, actually, Pospo. I think you're absolutely right. My view is, ideally, the statues would be in a museum, and there'd be a whole heap of information, warts and all, about this person and why it is they got to be so rich. Because frankly, if you don't pay your workers, then you make loads of money. That's why we've got so many fantastic stately homes in Britain, because a lot of people didn't pay their workers. It's as simple as that, right? Either they had slave workers or they had indentured labour. So, all the East Indian people who were sent over to the West Indies to work for a pittance, things like that. And we ought to be aware of that and know about it. The risk with just destroying and levelling things to the ground is that actually they get denied then. They're easily deniable. Just think about it. If Auschwitz wasn't there, then there would be people who would just completely deny the Holocaust and say, no, I think you're wrong. And there'd be no evidence. So I think it's useful to have the statues there, but you've got to have all the information there, warts and all, ideally in a museum, but if not, maybe people might at least put the plaque there, and I've no doubt I'm sure someone will end up defacing it anyway. But you'd explain why.
Before we close, you were just appointed one of the college's race and equality leads. Congratulations, by the way. So what are you going to do from this position to combat racism?
Okay, well, possibly I'm going to sort it all out, obviously. It took give me a couple of weeks, but yeah. So the idea is to try and, just to say to everybody, it feels a bit overwhelming, but actually there are lots of recommendations about how we can start to make a little bit of a difference, to change some of the structural factors so that there's better access and experience and better outcomes for everybody, just to level up that, that disadvantage a bit. And essentially, what we want to do is to develop a strategy to implement those recommendations. So, and the hope is, we've got 3 years, but the hope is that people will support us to do that. So we don't need to have another big commission. We don't need to have lots more, soul searching, etc. That's all been done. And what I'm interested in is actually definitely making a practical, tangible difference. And that means implementing the recommendations that are there, evaluating them, and see if they work.
Amazing. That was a mind opener, Lade. Thank you so much. Dr. Lade Smith, people, next week we turn the page and move to that beautiful junction where neurology meets psychiatry. the field of neuropsychiatry, with me, Professor Trudy Chowder, who tirelessly led the largest ever trial of functional dissociative seizures, one of the most common, yet so minimally understood and hugely mismanaged disorders out there. See you next Monday at 1 p.m. Until then, Pospo for Multi Learning, over and out.